Hello and welcome to Life in the Pit, episode number 76. My name is David Lane. You'll notice if you're a longtime listener or even a recent listener, you'll notice the lack of opening credit music and the voice of Bill Cisna introducing me. I wanted to just make this informal. It's been 10 weeks since there's been a Life in the Pit episode, and I just thought we're almost at the end of 2022. And I wanted to come on and just give an end-of-year episode and also provide a little clarity of why it's been 10 weeks and why, it'll probably be, quite a bit longer before the next episode. Also, apologies as I go. There's a lot of extra room noise and noise from other rooms as I'm recording this. This is pretty spontaneous. I didn't plan a good time to do this. There's a lot going on that I won't talk about that has just been, life stuff. And so getting time to record has been hard just because of that. Before I get too far into this, I want to go ahead and say thank you to all of you for listening to Life in the Pit. It really means a lot. Even though it's been 10 weeks since the last episode and we haven't had as many episodes in 2022, I believe I counted this might be the 18th, but probably about 12 of them were the first half of the year. That said, about once a week or so, I go on to my server just to kind of see, how things are doing. And the listener counts on every episode are going up every week. Even though there's no new material, it tells me that some of you are discovering Life in the Pit even while it's not active, and that's very encouraging as a podcaster. But it's also encouraging for the reason that I got into this, and this might kind of get into the story of Life in the Pit, and also why. After a little over 2 years, it's not going away, but I'll say more about that. It's definitely on an inactive hiatus at the moment. When I started this podcast, it was the year 2020, which we know what the main event was going on in that time, and and I've said this before outside this podcast when people have asked me about it. I had wanted to do a podcast for some time, and I thought I wanted to offer something that wasn't being done to death by everyone else. So the first thing that had always come to mind was, I have a lot of knowledge and experience with film music. But the number of film music podcasts out there at the time was pretty incredibly high, and it just seems like it's tripled or quadrupled since then. It is a crowded landscape if you want to be a film scorer or a film composing podcast. But one thing I did know something about, because I had like 9 continuous years of experience going into the start of the podcast in 2020, that nobody else was doing. And I mean, I searched pretty hard. Maybe I missed a term, and maybe I'm not the first, and maybe I'm not the only. But I couldn't find anything about pit musicians. I could find plenty of things about theater, and I could find plenty of things about musicians. And occasionally there would be like a bigger theater episode that would talk to a pit musician, but nobody was talking mainly about those who play in the pit. And it was one of the fascinating things. It took a few shows before I got into it. But, I played in orchestra, I've played in wind ensemble, I've played in chamber ensembles, I've played in a rock band, actually a couple of different rock bands, and of course I've done solo stuff. And what pit musicians have to go through in a theatrical setting is just kind of mind-boggling. So I have a washing machine in the background, so it's probably getting a little bit louder right now. Sorry for the less than ideal recording conditions. Anyway, as I was saying, even on a local community theater level, I was surrounded by really truly highly competent musicians that were playing music that sometimes was well prepared, sometimes it was handwritten, sometimes it had a lot of mistakes, and we were marking it up saying, okay, take out measures 72 to 84. We're going to cut from the end of 71 to 85. And when you get to 85, we're going to repeat that measure 3 times. And we're going to go to measure it at 88, and we're going to do that as a vamp and watch to jump cut at any point to measure 89. And then, if an actor missed a line or jumped ahead, I would know it. But the musicians don't have the full score. I would think they wouldn't know it, and yet more often than not, they all seem to catch on, and they jump ahead really quickly. And that's actually been very influential in an ongoing project, seeing what all these musicians had, and also one of the things that I've really thought about over the years that made me really like playing in theater music. There's a lot of music out there, and I'll just go ahead and say, if you play in a symphony orchestra, I don't think you'd ever lose your job if you couldn't play something by ear. But you certainly would if you couldn't sight read well. And, if you play in a rock band, if you play in a lot of jazz bands, like small combos, not big band. But there are types of music out there where playing by ear is a premium, and you need to be able to do it, but no one's going, if you're struggling with sight reading or don't even really read music, you'll do fine. You don't always have to transpose, in most jobs. But when you're in theater music, if you're going to be a musician that gets called on a lot, and if you're not a rhythm instrument, you probably have to play more than one instrument. So you can't just play, if you just play saxophone, there's not a whole lot of shows that you're going to be able to play for. If you play saxophone, clarinet, and flute, and you do all 3 well, you're in high demand. You need to be able to sight read. You sometimes need to be able to transpose. You sometimes need to be able to play by ear. Sometimes need to be able to improvise, and on it goes. The level of musicianship, and of course, playing your instrument at a high level goes without saying, as with anything that you would do as a musician. It just got me thinking about all the things that you need to be able to do. And I picked up, I've been fortunate, I've been very thankful to have some great guests. The first couple of dozen episodes was mostly, with few exceptions, local colleagues, people that I knew, or sometimes maybe people that I knew from college that aren't local anymore. But they were, for the most part, I think with one exception in the first 25, 26 episodes, were people that I already knew. And as we have expanded from there, I found out that some of the people I knew have been on Broadway tours, and or have gone to school with people who have been on Broadway, or I've even had people reach out to me that were listeners that had that experience, and I've had something like 11 or 12 people who have been in a Broadway pit, several others that have been on a Broadway tour, and I've learned so much from just talking to them, and I hope that you have too, if you're interested in, just being a pit musician. And the one thing that I've heard said in probably 95% of all the episodes where I interviewed anybody was the importance of sight reading. And I established that in my mind. That is a tool that every great musician needs. And wow, you can tell I have no outline for this particular chat, because I've already kind of taken this into the main reason that I haven't been recording lately, and that is because I have a new podcast. I mentioned this at the end of the last episode, so you can hear a little bit about it there. But I have a podcast that's going to be launching on January 2nd, Monday. It's going to come out every Monday, once a week, and I'm going to have occasionally some shorter episodes probably coming out on Thursdays, not every week. It's going to be called The Musician Toolkit. I've since discovered that there is a company out there that uses an apostrophe, musicians, and they call themselves the Musicians Toolkit. So I kind of hope they don't have a podcast. I haven't found one yet, so I don't mean to compete with them. And they're offering services. I'm offering kind of podcast linked to, for those who are interested, my teaching services. And if you want to know more about the tools that go into the Musician Toolkit of what is kind of the basis of my podcast, if you are on Instagram, you can just scroll my feed. It's at David Lane Music, and you can go, just go down and I've introduced 18 already. On Monday, I'm going to introduce the 19th tool, or actually sometime this weekend, I'm going to introduce the 19th, and on Monday, I'm going to introduce the 20th of the 20 tools that go into the Musician Toolkit. So on this feed, on this podcast feed, I'm going to actually share the trailer that I do either next week or early the following week, all about the podcast and so forth. So I'll be getting more into what that podcast is and what I plan on doing. But if you want to follow that, if you want to, see the tools, the 18 that I've done so far, you can find them, again, kind of scattered on Instagram or Facebook. Facebook is at David M. Lane Music. Instagram is at David Lane Music. And I am, since the last episode, I am on TikTok, and that is also at David Lane Music. At least I think it's David Lane Music. I don't think I had to put a number in there. So hopefully that is something that will show up. And probably the most organized place that you can find it is on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, and my channel is at David Lane Music 1, David Lane Music 1, the number 1. Click on Shorts, and you can, or you may be able to find playlists. There's a playlist there called the Musician Toolkit, or Tools of Musicianship, and it's the essential 20 tools, and you can watch them all in order. They're all short videos. The longest one is right at a minute, but several are shorter than that. So, probably takes 15 minutes to watch all 18 videos. Okay, but this really isn't completely news. This is kind of old news. I was planning this podcast really since August or September. So the last several episodes, it's been in my mind, and I did talk about it on episode 75 at the end, the last 7 or 8 minutes of that episode. So you can hear what I had to say about it at the time. But the plan was to continue on a once-a-month basis of getting in new guests and, just continuing to put out episodes on Life in the Pit. And, that just hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened because I haven't reached out to anybody. And I haven't reached out to anybody because I've gotten more and more ambitious with this podcast, the new one. And just trying to do a minimum amount of work so that I can get a little bit of a buffer before I get started. And just trying to do all of the promotional work that I like before I get started. That's just turned out to be really kind of not, I won't say overwhelming, but it fills the time to where I really can't think about 2 podcasts at the moment. Now, one thing that if you know me well, that you would come to find out is that I don't like the words always and never. So I don't like to say, it's hard for me to say that this is done. There are aspects of musicianship, like I went to college to be a film composer. I have never said, like some of my colleagues that I've met that had the same thing. They say I don't do films anymore. I've moved on. And I've met people like that. They've, one of my good friends, he made that very clear. He doesn't want that in his life anymore because he wants to focus on what he's doing. And I really think that's the healthy way to do it. I almost never score films, but I keep saying that is something that I do because I don't want to cut it off. I don't want to close that door. And I don't want to close the door on this podcast. So it's possible that it may be a very long time before there's another episode. But if I come across a Broadway musician with a good story, or touring musician, and I think there's something that's good for this podcast, I want to have that open. So I don't want to say that Life in the Pit is over, but I think it's fair that I just tell you guys that it's just not going on. Now, I think I could have overcome all of this. I could have overcome the busyness with this new podcast, the Musician Toolkit, if my heart was still in it as far as being a pit musician. And I'm not sure exactly where that switched. I think I'd been transitioning toward that kind of going into the pandemic. I think the idea is leaving that 2019, going into 2020, that I could use a break. And of course, we all had forced a break. And I was just picturing getting really excited, getting back into playing for the pit. But as I played in masks, and as I sometimes played, for pre-recorded or streaming shows, and then as the masks came off, I never did really feel that spark again. I even did a bucket list show, which was the last one that I did with a live pit, and that was Into the Woods. And I certainly loved the pit experience. I loved getting to do the show, but 90% of the time I was there, I was like, my heart wasn't there. And I don't think that what I described on the episode, that's ironically my most popular and most downloaded episode, the one that says a story of failure, when I wasn't prepared for a Broadway touring gig and I got let go. That's not something, first of all, if it ever happens to you and you love pit music, this shouldn't even be a blimp in your life. This is just experience. You learn from it, and you get right back out there, and you keep pursuing it. And so there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I learned a lot. But one of the things that I learned, and this was something I did within about 48, 72 hours, and I didn't want to talk about it at the time on the podcast because I didn't think that was good, depending on how long and how frequent I keep this going. But I feel like I should share this with you just in case, you come to the same crossroads. When I was not at all surprised when I was let go from this show, that was a Broadway tour coming through my area that hired locally. I didn't really feel prepared going in. And I was in a situation where it didn't help me relax. So I actually didn't play my best, and I don't think my best was as good as it should have been. And I sat down afterwards and I went through, what could I have done to have been prepared? Was it something that I could have done? And my answer was yes, I absolutely could have done some things to prepare, and I know exactly what they are. But some of them would involve changing the rest of my work schedule so that I could be available for certain high-profile shows and getting that type of experience. And also investing in the equipment that makes me a serious theater pit keyboardist. And I compared that to all the other things in my life that I do professionally. And I just decided I'm not willing to do that. It's nice that I got my one day touring, or I should say my one day rehearsing with a Broadway tour orchestra. That's an experience that maybe as time goes by I'll think even more fondly of than I do right now. But it was something that I had to say, okay, am I willing to take the lessons from this to be able to do this gig better next time? And I really didn't have to think too hard about it. And it was, no, I'm not willing. Not at this point in my life. I have other things that I have more of a passion for, that I badly need to focus on. So theater for me, I just said, okay, it's going to go at a local level. Well, local level does not pay at a Broadway touring rate. And if you are making a surplus of money in other jobs, that doesn't necessarily matter if you love it. But I was getting burnout. I was trying to teach later, beyond the start time of most rehearsals, and was having to reschedule a lot of students. And the whole rehearsal process was just something that I just found frustrating. And now I still, my 2023 goal is I want to play in the pit at least once, but I can't be doing it, for 6 to 9 productions in a year. It's just, I don't feel like I could do that anymore. So that's something that I fully realized after doing Into the Woods in May. And so June, July, basically June onward, my heart hasn't been in it. It's hard for me. It's been hard for me to even prepare the podcast episodes for Life in the Pit, knowing that I don't really have much of a life in the pit at the moment. So another thing that that people will know about me is that I'm very much opposed to black and white thinking on just about anything. I fully believe the expression that you can have two conflicting thoughts simultaneously, and one is that I don't have much of an interest or a life in the pit right now, but I still love the art of playing in the pit. I love chatting with people and playing with people who do it well, and I would still like to occasionally do it. And also, I still, once upon a time, really truly loved it. It really changed my life. It gave me new direction, it helped me to meet people, helped me take me in different places in my life over the last decade or so. And none of that would have been possible without my experience, as a theater music director, as a keyboardist, and, eventually leading to this podcast. And even though I know I'm not the most charismatic host, and I know this is a very niche subject, as long as I can, as long as it's possible, I'm going to keep all the episodes available on this podcast stream. Because, as I said, people are still finding them. People are still listening to them. It is, until someone else gets the same idea and decides to pursue it, it is still the only resource out there for pit musicians. And I don't think I missed any major instruments. I think at least once I covered every major instrument that you would find in a pit orchestra. And we've talked about like brass doubling, woodwind doubling. We've talked about programming keyboards. We've talked about just being a conductor, being an accompanist, being an audition accompanist. And by the way, I do want to say some of my most favorite episodes were from 2022. I don't want to single them out because that always sounds like I'm saying, well, the other episodes weren't that good. But I would just go ahead and say, if I was making a top 10 personal favorite Life in the Pit episode list, I think at least 5 of them, 4 or 5, would be from episodes that I did this year. Some that are just they're really fun, that I would go back and listen to them again just because I want to hear what the guests have to say. Now, I want to say one more thing about this podcast and then one more thing about my new podcast. So the one more thing about this podcast is just a reiteration. Don't be surprised if there's an episode or 2 in 2023. Once I get the Musician Toolkit on its feet and, I start getting a workflow, and I do have a list of guests I'm going to follow up with and see if they're interested, and definitely would like to have them, come on and, continue Life in the Pit occasionally. It's just, it won't be often enough to even register as something that you can count on. But I'll always let you know through Instagram, Facebook, and of course, this feed will notify you if you're subscribed and following on wherever you get your podcasts. There will be, I would say the odds of there being if I just in betting terms, the odds of 2 episodes is greater than the odds of 0. Yeah, I'd say, so we'll just put it like that. That's about as optimistic as I can get. Now, I want to say this about the Musician Toolkit. Some of you, if you're listening this far, if you haven't like cut off the episode and said this one's not for me, if you're still listening, thank you. And I want to go ahead and say, if you've made it to this point, I'm not going to do a lot of advertising about the Musician Toolkit on the Life in the Pit social feeds. I may have mentioned something every now and then, but I'm not going to push very hard. But if you're listening to this, I want to say, I think that at least 90% of you would enjoy it. If you came to this podcast as kind of theater first, music second, you really wanted just to hear about theater, and this is just another aspect of theater, then you're probably not going to find the Musician Toolkit your cup of tea. But if you came this as music first and then theater, if you came at it as you're a musician and you like the idea of playing for theater and you like all the skills that are involved in the collaboration, well, those are the types of things that inspired me for the Musician Toolkit. And I'm going to have a lot of solo episodes like this one, but I'm also going to have a lot of guests, and we're going to talk about, you've heard so many guests on this podcast talk about sight reading. Well, I've already found 2 experts with courses on sight reading. We're going to come on and talk about how to get better at sight reading. I'm going to talk to people who specialize in ear training and how you can improve your ear. I'm also going to be going around, and maybe even a pit musician included, I'm going to talk about various types of jobs you can have as a musician and what are the tools you need to develop to be good at that job. And that kind of comes back from my Broadway tour story. It would have been good going into it to have a full grasp of what do I need to be able to do well in order to succeed at this type of job. And that's not what most other podcasts do. Most other podcasts are, if they're talking about that, even this one included, talks about who are the people you have to meet and what are the business things you have to do. But it kind of assumes that you've already done the work in the practice room and you've done the work in, in wherever you go to school for music. So we're going to talk about those things. We're going to get into, if you want to just think of it from a pit musician's perspective, how can you become a better pit musician? But we're not going to be that narrow. It's going to be, what if you decided you wanted to, play in a symphony orchestra, if you wanted to go to Hollywood and, play for film music, or if you want to start taking up composing or arranging, or if you want to be a conductor, whatever it is, we're going to talk about what are the tools you need to work on and how do you work on those tools? What are some techniques to get them better? So I'm just really excited about this approach. And the other thing is that this podcast is a little bit more, the Musician Toolkit is a little bit more personal because, as I said, I'm not in the pit at the moment. But I'm still an educator, I'm still a performer, a composer, and I really want to share with aspiring musicians, with music students, some things that they can do to just become better musicians that maybe is a supplement to their music education, but, given how expensive tuition is, it might be a replacement. It might be just something that that's kind of a template for how they can improve themselves. And I would always advocate, hopefully with a few accomplished mentors, to help you along the way. Even if you don't have the degree, you do want the professional guidance. So if you want to follow the Musician Toolkit, I may change my mind later, but again, it's kind of really interconnected to a lot of the services that I offer outside of being a podcaster. So it's on my personal feeds. It's on David Lane Music at Instagram and TikTok. It's going to be on at David Lane Music 1. I'm going to be doing a lot more video stuff on YouTube. So at David Lane Music 1 there. It's at David M Lane Music on Facebook, and a lot of those I've gone ahead and put the musician toolkit in kind of like parentheses. So definitely, if you were intrigued by the musician aspect of Life in the Pit, I think you'll like the musician toolkit. Definitely highly encourage you to check it out. And not just because, I want to pick up some listeners as soon as possible. But I think you'll get a lot out of it. And I think even if you're coming from this, I just want to be a pit musician, I think you'll hear some other things. Because if you notice, when I interviewed some Broadway musicians, they always talked about the other projects they were doing. It was never, I just play music for theater. What you get from outside experiences, you can take back in. So, it's something that I really highly request. Okay, I've gone over a little over 30 minutes. There was no opening credit music. There will be no closing credit music. This is just kind of an informal, very unscripted, no outline at all. I just wanted to come on and just, first of all, not to let it go overlooked, say thank you very much for listening to Life in the Pit. And I hope if you've missed some episodes, I hope you go back and check them out and still share them. Someone would like to know about pit musicians. I want to hear from some of the great musicians that we've had on as guests. So please share them. And, look me up on my personal feeds. So just one more time for socials. Now, Life in the Pit is at Life in the Pit Pod on Facebook and Instagram. It's also on Twitter, but I almost never post there. The Musician Toolkit or anything connected with anything else I do, you can find on Facebook at David M. Lane Music. And I actually am pretty active on Twitter, although not so much with the podcast. Also David M. Lane Music. Instagram and TikTok is at David Lane Music. And also definitely check out and go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube. Everything associated with the podcast, including preview clips, will be posted there. And you might find that a more entertaining way to go than simply just listening. But you'll be able to find Musician Toolkit on the podcast feed starting probably right after Christmas, so 26th. I think you'll start seeing a preview then. And I'll, of course, mention that on my social feeds. The YouTube link, by the way, is at David Lane Music 1. David Lane Music 1. Thank you all once again for listening to Life in the Pit, and I hope you have a happy holidays and a very happy and successful 2023.